Robert Spitzer joins me now from Williamsburg, Virginia. He's a Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus in Political Science Department at the State University of New York-Cortland. And he's also the author of 5 books on gun policy, including The Politics of Gun Control. We really appreciate having you on the show today, Robert. Now, President Biden is, of course, the consoler-in-chief. He's there to share the trauma of this community, but he's also a Democrat in a conservative state. In a community who want to see change, but perhaps see it differently in the way that he might, how will Biden need to speak to the people of Uvalde today?
Well, his tone and tenor is going to be a mix of sorrow, anger, I think, outrage at the lack of action, and also some of the problems in terms of what happened on site when that massacre took place earlier this week, where the police delayed their response. And that, it makes it an even more difficult situation to deal with. The thing about Vice President Biden, if you look at the arc of his career, he's very much a man who wears his heart on his sleeve, and everybody who knows him will tell you that his emotions are genuine. He feels, sort of feels the pain of the people. He knows what it's like to lose close family members in other contexts, to be sure. And he is pretty good in these kinds of circumstances, although he also certainly wants to see policy change and action in Washington as well, and that's part of the frustration, I think, that he is feeling and will be expressing.
But also, given that Texas is a state and many people who live there are fierce defenders of the First Amendment and gun rights, what do you think might be some of the common sense safety measures that Texans could get behind?
Well, there is support in conservative states for measures like what's called a red flag law, which would be pertinent to the case at hand in Texas. That is to say, these are laws that 20 states have adopted, including some conservative states, that say if you know somebody, if you're a family member, for example, and you have a family member who owns guns and who has expressed homicidal or suicidal thoughts, you can go to a local judge and say, I think this person's, my relative's guns should be taken away from him. Police can intercede. They can scoop up the guns, hold a hearing to determine whether keeping the guns away from the person is justified or not. And the person need not have committed a crime. If the person expresses certain dire kinds of warnings that indicate something bad is about to happen, there is a possibility that the police can take those guns away. And those measures have been fairly effective in the states that have them. And that's something that there's widespread support for, although I would be surprised if Texas actually adopted such a law.
There are so many issues that, contributed to what went wrong last week in Uvalde. For example, one of them being an active shooter drill was held in the Uvalde School District just 2 months ago, but obviously it didn't go to plan. People or someone didn't follow protocol. What needs to change when it comes to school preparedness, given gun laws probably aren't going to change anytime soon?
Well, I think fundamentally public schools are doing the right thing all around the country. This is a process of improving security at public schools that dates back more than 20 years, and schools all across the country have been doing and engaging in reasonable safety practices, for everything from locking doors to having cameras installed to having what they call resource officers, which are police officers or similarly trained people on site at public schools, lockdown drills, other kinds of activities that have been fairly effective. And this shooting, of course, is absolutely terrible and horrendous, but we do need to remember that public schools in America, and there are public schools plus private schools, kindergarten through 12, there are roughly 130,000 of them in America, and they educate around 50 million children every day. And the fact is that statistically speaking, children in those schools are safer than they are on the streets or even in their own homes. So things are going right. And it's also important to point out that many instances of potential shootings have been thwarted. That doesn't get so much attention. But obviously these efforts have to be redoubled, and partly it's an implementation thing. That is, you've got these standards, now make sure you're following them.
Just to counter what you just said there in terms of safety and children, from what I understand, firearms were the leading cause of death of children in 2020, 42 acts of gun violence in 21. That smashed the previous record of 30. What is driving this spike?
Well, I think in the short, I think we've got a more short-term matter at play here pertaining and dating to the pandemic of the last couple of years, where people were locked down in their homes. There was greater domestic unrest within people's homes. They were together when they weren't necessarily wanting to be because of the pandemic. And a lot of people went out and bought guns. Millions of people went out and bought guns. Most of them were people who already owned guns, but some of them were people for whom gun ownership was something new. And that is a formula for more guns getting in the wrong hands. And that, in general, I think has driven the increase in gun shootings that we have seen nationwide in the last couple of years. It's a disturbing trend, to be sure.
All right, Robert, we'll have to leave it there. Really appreciate your time. Robert Spitzer, author and also Professor Emeritus at the State University of New York-Cortland.